It's like, feels to me like a kind of gathering of the clans, and people coming in from far-flung parts of Sydney and New South Wales in order to wave the flag for heterodox economics. So that's fantastic. That's how it should be. That's exactly what the legacy of Frank Stilwell and his senior colleagues has been. My task tonight is a very pleasurable one. In front of you, you have the portrait of the late Ted Wheelwright. There is another portrait under a black covering over there, inspired by the red tie of Ted Wheelwright and his lecture from years gone past. A local artist, Miss Judith O'Connell Prince, was inspired to paint a picture of one of our dear friends and colleagues from Political Economy. And without any further ado, I am going to trundle over to that side of the stage in order to see what's underneath. We'll do this together. And are you ready? Grab a little bit of the cloth. Grab a bit of the cloth. Are you ready?
To welcome the 10th annual Wheelwright lecturer, I'm going to pass on to one of Kathy's pretty cool friends, Dick Bryan. Thanks, Dick.
Thanks, Liz. It remains to be seen at the end of this introduction whether Kathy and I are still good friends. Let's see what goes. I first met Kathy in 1981 in Canberra at the home of our political economy colleague, Lynn Chester. I recall our first conversation was, at least in part, about the organic composition of capital in coal mining. No one talks about the organic composition of capital in coal mining anymore. Nor do Kathy and I, for that matter. At the time, Kathy was involved in an international research project headed by Anwar Sheikh at the New School for Social Research in New York. Many of you will know his work. It was a project about transforming conventional national accounts into Marxian value categories. It didn't take Kathy long to work out that, as well as being a virtually impossible task, this project ultimately lacked a politics. It became apparent to Kathy that the objective of research should not be to show that Marxian value categories are better than conventional ones in explaining how capitalist economies work. The objective should be to build analysis and practices that abolish capitalist value itself, to find existing and potential forms of economic activities that are not driven by profit criteria, but by social and ecological goals. This turn led in 1996 to the publication of The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, a feminist critique of political economy. This book was a joint work with Kathy's dear friend and colleague, the late, the remarkable Julie Graham. The book had immediate and long-lasting impact. It's been reissued and translated into many languages. It led debates about non-capitalist practices lying inside what are standardly called capitalist economies. And it opened discussion that Kathy still participates in and still leads about the possibilities of community-based post-capitalist modes of organising. More broadly, Kathy and Julie's work was and remains a leading contribution to big social debates about post-capitalist societies. In 2011, the leading international human geography journal declared The End of Capitalism as We Knew It to be a classic. Kathy and Julie were inducted into the Human Geography Hall of Fame. More than this, Kathy has not only written about post-capitalist economies and polities, but she's also gone into the field, especially in the Philippines, in Australia and in the South Pacific, to facilitate the building and empowerment of alternative communities, a process that she and her colleagues describe as taking back the economy. It's this combination of scholarly work and political engagement in the field that makes Kathy's work so remarkable and makes her in such demand internationally as an inspiring speaker and mentor. In Australia, Kathy's held academic positions at Sydney University. Indeed, Ted Wheelwright's Transnational Corporations Research Project transferred to Kathy's Department of Geography when Ted retired at the age of 65. She's also held senior positions at Monash, the ANU, and now, of course, at Western Sydney University. She's been a visitor at more universities around the world than you could possibly imagine, and probably more than Kathy can remember. She's a person of true international significance, and we're so fortunate to have her here with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming the presenter of the 2017 Wheelwright Lecture, Kathy Gibson.
Thank you to all of you for coming here tonight. I'm very honoured to have been asked to present the Wheelwright Lecture, especially in this year that marks a decade since Ted died. And I want to acknowledge his very memorable contribution to Australian society and to the development of political economy here at Sydney University, but also political economy in the country in general. Interestingly though, looking back over the list of past Wheelwright lecturers, I was kind of surprised to find that I'm actually the first Australian to give it. Especially, of course, because Ted was an economic nationalist. He was an exporter Englishman, but very into Australian nationalism. So I'm carrying the flag, and I'm very honoured, even more, to have been asked to do this. And I'd like to thank Liz very much for fostering the invitation and helping to organise this event. So, as Dick mentioned, I actually did know Ted personally. At least I'd say I came within his orbit. I studied geography in the building next to the economics department where Ted was located in the 1970s, and then I was a lecturer there in the same locale in the 1980s. So I remember well his tall, commanding figure, his ruddy face and wonderful white hair, which we see in the portrait, his gentlemanly manners and firebrand lecturing style. And I also recall with great admiration his work with Greg Crow setting up the Transnational Corporations Research Project and churning out research papers that focused public debate on foreign ownership and the changing face of manufacturing under the impact of a new international division of labour. Manufacturing was a key interest of Ted's, not only because his name, Wheelwright, kind of gestures towards the beginnings of manufacturing, but also because his father was a steelworker. And he was also a great advocate of national economic development. And I guess I want to take up with some of these topics in this lecture. And I'm going to tell a few Australian stories and I hope make a few connections. Well, manufacturing played a role in my upbringing as well. My father worked in the food manufacturing industry all of his life, and I was introduced to the factory floor early on. At the end of the Second World War, he and a number of his army friends all got jobs together in a family business of another mate who was in the unit. The bottling and canning business had a franchise from an English company to make fish and meat pastes. And it was, the company was called Pex Paste. And for those of you who are of a certain age, and I know there are many of us here, you might well remember its advertising slogan, "A little bit goes such a long way." I must say, sick of having it on my sandwiches every lunchtime. But Dad travelled up and down the coast of New South Wales, negotiating supply with fishermen's co-ops. And as production manager, he oversaw the running of the factory and employment of workers, many of whom early on were European refugees. The factory at Rosebery prospered during the long boom, but after 23 years, Dad was ousted by the son of the managing director and found himself looking for a job. He was relatively quickly appointed as manager of a prawn packing and exporting company that had recently transitioned from being a small family concern to being owned by QUF, or Queensland United Food, and then began a roller coaster of company mergers, international takeovers and global restructuring that he experienced from the inside. The smell of fish never left his work clothes, but the organisational context within which that aroma wafted dramatically changed during his post-war work life from 1946 to the end of the 1980s. The Ted Wheelwright's research exposed the contours and consequences of foreign takeovers and what became known as globalisation in the Australian economy. It was then in the late 1970s that the narrative of a precarious manufacturing sector in Australia was first seeded. Today, the prognosis of decline has intensified with plant closures in the foreign-owned car industry and the shedding of 200,000 jobs between 2008 and 2015. As we know, just a week ago, the last car plants finally closed. A frightening vision looms of a hollowed-out Australian economy with an almost absent manufacturing sector. In the public debate, questions have been asked such as, do we need a manufacturing sector? What makes manufacturing in Australia viable? How should policy assist the manufacturing sector? And it was in this context of hand-wringing and panic about whether we should ever make things again in Australia that my colleagues and I were awarded an Australian Research Council grant to conduct qualitative research on manufacturing enterprises. The title of our project that I'm going to talk a bit about tonight is Reconfiguring the Enterprise, Shifting Manufacturing Culture in Australia. As I said, I'll make brief reference to some of the very preliminary findings of that work in this lecture. But I want to start by, first of all, setting the stage for our inquiry and give you a sense of what our concerns as researchers are. And here when I'm saying our, I'm referring to my dear colleagues Stephen Healy and Jenny Cameron, both of whom unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, and Joe McNeil, who I hope is somewhere around. There you are. Great, good, you can answer the questions. And I'm also partly referring to the Community Economies Collective, which is the kind of my intellectual home, really, the group that Julie and I set up and started many years ago now. And some of these concerns are very much shared by that group. So I want to look a bit at what these wider issues are, what I see as the primary challenges facing manufacturing futures, not only in Australia, but actually in the world. So come with me and think big and think backwards. I want you to jump to the planetary scale and the longue durée. The science is now in. A stratigraphic signal has been identified that sets off a new geological era from the Holocene. The horizon occurs around the 1950s. It's marked by the appearance of manufactured materials in sediments including plastics, aluminium and concrete, and coincides with global spikes in fallout radionuclides and particulates from fossil fuel consumption. Plastic, aluminium, concrete, fuel particulates. These manufactured materials are very familiar. They're what we drink from, what we live in, what we move with. In all the agitated debate about what we should call this geological era, contentiously named the Anthropocene, or the Capital Ocene, or the Plantation Ocene, or other more unpronounceable Ocenes, perhaps we should add the post-war manufacturing Ocene. So here we have, I think, one of the issues at stake when thinking about the future of manufacturing. Is it to continue to contribute to planetary climate instability and environmental degradation, or not? Can manufacturing and the kind of consumption practices it fosters be part of a solution to global warming? That's just one of the challenges. The paper in Science that I put up before states that the inflection point at 1950 coincides with what's been called the Great Acceleration, here echoing Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. That is, the prominent rise in economic activity and resource consumption that coincides with the rise of human-induced global warming. The bits of plastic, concrete and aluminium, these artefacts of manufacturing production that have insinuated themselves into the sedimentary record, are traces of an elaborate assemblage of material and social relationships that's burgeoned exponentially over my lifetime. As you know, yes, I am a 1950s baby. So here are some of the biophysical changes that have been associated with this great acceleration. And here, these have been collected together by Will Steffen and his colleagues in a paper published in 2015, The Trajectory of the Anthropocene. Very familiar, the rise of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. Stratospheric ozone is probably one of the only ones that started to see a decline. And here are some of the socio-economic trends that are also has seen exponential growth since this dotted line, the 1950s. The ramping up of all these Earth system and social system indicators since the 1950s has obviously contributed to massive wealth generation, as well as global warming and planetary climate change. And of those of you who are interested in political economy will well know that this period has seen both decades of wealth redistribution within some nation states, driven by national policies informed by socialist and social democratic values, and more recently, decades of wealth polarisation, informed by the neoliberalisation of everything. This shows up in Piketty's graphs of the percentage share of income going to the top decile in a range of countries over the period 1910 to 2010. In Australia, the period of the Great Acceleration then coincides with 25 years or so of wealth sharing, as roughly indicated by a declining share of income going to the top 10%. And then a turnaround and a marked rise from the mid-1980s on, and this being a kind of rough indication of growing inequality. So here is, I think, the second issue that's at stake when thinking about the future of manufacturing. How is it to address this disparity in wealth distribution? Can manufacturing enterprise address the challenge to produce a more equal society? These two sets of issues are encapsulated, I think, in the idea of just sustainability that's been coined by Julian Ackerman. The need to ensure a better quality of life for all now and into the future in a just and equitable manner, whilst living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. For me, the challenge of the coming of the Anthropocene and the neoliberalisation of everything are spurs to action. Neither are necessarily a done deal. So let's come back to the promise of manufacture. From manus, the Latin for hands, and facere, to make. So hands making. And note, the stem word for facture or factum is also the origins of fact, something we also make. As you'll recall, Marx made a lot of the distinction between manufacture, which he associated with craft production, and machinofacture, which he associated with modern industry, thus signalling a marginalisation of the hand in the process of production. Today, current theorists of the workplace point to the shift from machinofacture to robofacture, and perhaps soon to be replaced by algofacture, or the making by algorithms, and further marginalisation, as though it were a fait accompli, of the role of the hand with its very human capacities for hand, eye, brain, aesthetic coordination in making. At the same time, others, like colleagues Chantal Carr and Chris Gibson, are opening up wider issues around making. They're raising fundamental and important questions about how humans manipulate materials, compose objects, and construct economies and societies around material things, as well as how this might be done differently. This work has been inspirational to us in our project. In our research on manufacturing, we've selected companies to study because they seemed to be doing some things differently. And our research challenge has been, and still is, to figure out what that is. So I've situated our interest in manufacturing futures with respect to the big challenges of our time. Now I want to give a sense of how the project is theoretically informed by anti-essentialist Marxism and post-structuralist feminism. So I want to indicate how this kind of intellectual heritage, my intellectual heritage, has shaped our approach by telling a few stories about previous research projects that have led to this one. So, anti-essentialist Marxism. Now, I'll just very briefly characterise this at the moment as an interest in economic difference, as opposed to sameness, especially, but not only, class difference. Having been trained as a Marxian political economist to focus on the never-ending and inventive shenanigans of capitalism with a big C, all because somehow this would help to change the world, not just understand it, my friend and author, co-author Julie Graham and I decided that we couldn't keep waiting for the revolution. A pivotal moment for me occurred in the, I think it was mid to late 1980s, during an address given by trade union leader and class warrior Laurie Carmichael, when he was putting the case for workers to join in and get our bit of the world car for Australia. It was a time of global restructuring of the auto industry. My classical Marxist research on the relationship between falling rates of profit in manufacturing sectors, the kind of work that we were doing with Anwar Sheikh and others, and its relationship to the structural reconfiguring of the conditions of capital accumulation, was no news to unionists such as Laurie and the research office of the Metalworkers Union. What was confronting to me was that my and their critical Marxist analysis did not contribute any kind of strategy for transformation. The pragmatic approach was to get a bit of a part of the pie for the members and not to concede union power. Admittedly, this meant winning many concessions from powerful industry players, especially in the area of workplace training and career paths for workers. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we see how this strategy and subsequent versions of car industry plans played out. Millions of dollars in industry assistance have flowed to global auto companies, and well-paid employment has been enjoyed by a cohort of workers in various locations. Australia has been no different than some 80 countries around the world who have adopted similar strategies to keep their bit of the world car. But in the meantime, Australian consumers have been encouraged to lock into a petrol or diesel-hungry car culture, and innovation in R&D around cars of the future has been stymied and starved for funds. In a recent comment in the Sydney Morning Herald, Roy Green bemoans, and I quote here, the missed opportunity to provide anything like that kind of support to local component suppliers to diversify their product. Yet it's here, in this upstream set of small to medium-sized businesses, that much of Australia's future manufacturing capability arguably lies. This lack of imagination about what was to be done back there in the late 1980s led Julie and I to begin to deconstruct the hegemony of capitalocentric discourse, showing how it was preventing research on non-capitalist economic practices and organisations that had something to offer in terms of economic experimentation. And here we can see the 1996 version, very kind of Germanic Marxist-looking cover of The End of Capitalism with Sisyphus, the capitalism is Sisyphus rolling the stone up and keeps rolling back down to put us back at square one. And I'm much more attracted to the Turkish translation, where capitalism is represented as the robot churning up people, churning up the earth, eating up the earth, and there's Julie and I as the Davids, bobbing our little stones into the works to try and stuff it up. We're still trying, even from the grave. Extending out from our interest in the variety of class processes that actually coexist in the present, that interest in class as a process, we used our capacities as researchers to proliferate economic diversity and strategise other, what I might call more than capitalist development pathways. The successful regional industrial complex led by the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation was one inspiration for us, as it showed up the viability, longevity and industrial creativity of a cooperative class process, as were experiments with social enterprises, alternative trading networks, community land trusts and so on. Race Matthews's histories of cooperativism and distributivism in Australia provided insights into the barriers to this kind of economic experimentation in Australia. What our reframing of the economy as diverse did was to open up the possibility for other kinds of political economic theorising that might support transformation and not be locked into the do loop of critique and reinstatement of capitalist dominance. Of course, we were criticised for letting the side down, for embarking on, as I remember it, Hills Hoist socialism, for seeming to ignore power with a big P, and for naivety towards the cooperative state with a big S. So feminism, post-structuralist feminism in particular, liberated us though, to keep on going, despite the criticism, to reframe the relationship between epistemology and ontology. We took the idea of the performativity of gender into the realm of research, realising that all research is performative. That is, it contributes to making some things more real than others. And here I'm channeling John Ball. We were fed up with making capitalism more real and turned instead to making other worlds possible and other economies possible. Oops, pressing delete instead of go on. Feminism encouraged us to embrace a starting where you are with what you've got approach to socio and political change. This meant mobilising the productive aspects of power, but not neglecting them, but not fixating on structural power. And action research became our preferred method. In an early experiment with action research, I worked, I think in the early 1990s, with wives of coal miners in the Bowen Basin of central Queensland to shift the discourse about who should be consulted when it comes to workplace changes. Communities, families and miners were suffering the effects of mine site roster changes, what was called the 7-day roster, locally known as the divorce roster. The research, which was supported by the Miners' Union, remarkably, produced a new subjectivity for mining shift workers' partners and sought to have their voice heard in workplace negotiations. Looking back, this was the beginning, though, of the erosion of the livability of many small company mining towns in that region. The subsequent shift to the 12-hour workdays and the bus-in, bus-out model of working further undermined the social investment that had been made in mining towns and continues to produce family dysfunction under the banner of jobs, 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 and more money. This attempt to widen the scope of who are seen to be the stakeholders in an enterprise and who has a right to participate in workplace decisions taught me a lot about the possibilities for reframing to engender subjectivity change. Women were ready subjects of another kind of economy, but it also taught me a lot about how hard it is to shift or tilt an industry assemblage. The other action research intervention that I'll mention took place in the Latrobe Valley in the late 1990s, just after the Kennett government had privatised the power stations in the region and large retrenchments had taken place. Jenny Cameron and I were successful in enrolling the newly formed Latrobe City Council to partner in a project focused on reframing the valley economy as about people, not just about resources. We worked with retrenched workers and unemployed youth who really readily embraced a victimised and marginalised subject position, as well as single parents who were too busy doing largely unpaid work in the diverse economy to wallow in victimhood. A number of experiments were begun as part of our action research to provide purposeful employment, social connection and promote regional well-being, including a community garden, which was long before community gardens were so prevalent and supported by popular discourse, a woodworking and repair workshop, a circus performance training group, and a Santa's workshop in an abandoned kindergarten that carried on for a decade. What we learned from that project was that it was possible to take reluctant subjects of another economy and work together to become engaged subjects of a collective enterprise. But we also learnt how hard it was to marshal all the supports that were necessary to allow this other kind of economy to thrive. In 2014, some 14 years after our project formally ended, the Valley experienced another devastating blow when a fire broke out in the open-cut coal mine next to Hazelwood Power Station and burnt unchecked for a month. Carbon monoxide and fine dust filled the air and lungs of stranded Morwell residents. A corporate decision had been made by the owner, an international company 40% owned by the French government, to mothball the plant rather than fully close it, and thus to avoid the rehabilitation costs. The Voices of the Valley movement that formed out of this disaster has gone on to be a supporter of the Earthworker Cooperative. Earthworker Energy Manufacturing Cooperative is making solar hot water systems and drawing on the skill base of ex-power industry workers in the region. It seems that the moment is finally somewhat more propitious for non-capitalist cooperative enterprise development. But even so, the challenges to survival, and many of them are the same ones that we confronted earlier, are numerous. Well, action research is a slow burn, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back way of getting involved in social transformation. These 2 stories of previous research projects illustrate different strategies. The first involved working with those excluded from industry decision-making to try to insert their interests so that business might increase well-being directly. The second involved working with a region in which people were being thrown onto the scrap heap to try and develop a community-led form of economic development. In both cases, I was tilting at not windmills, but coal mines and the fossil fuel dependent power industry. I learnt that the mining industry is the elephant in the room when it comes to any discussion about economic futures in Australia. In the current project on manufacturing, though, we've taken a different tack. We've moved out of the excluded zone of women and households, moved away from the marginalised resource regions longing for different futures, and inserted ourselves into somewhat the capitalist mainstream, into the belly of the beast, to look for microbiomes of sustainability. We've sought out enterprises that are going some way towards achieving just sustainability, looking for experimental interventions, action researches, if you like, taking place within manufacturing enterprises. In line with our interest in economic diversity, here's the anti-essentialist Marxism coming in, we've been observing and interviewing multiple people from 10 different manufacturing enterprises, including private capitalist companies, cooperatives, and social enterprises with operations in metropolitan and regional New South Wales. And in line with our interest in the performativity of research, our post-structuralist feminism, our aim is to contribute to a new vision of manufacturing as a site of problem solving for planetary challenges. We want to identify elements of this vision and bring them to the fore so that they might participate in reframing how we understand cultures of manufacturing in Australia for the future. So in the remainder of the lecture, I want to tell 4 stories from our early research findings about, that was the one that's not there, about carpets, chassis, milk, and mattresses. And each story, I'll start with a symptomatic quote from our interviews that identifies one element of this other vision. And I'll briefly sketch out something of the context of each firm and then zoom in on a critical incident or a period of crisis when each enterprise has faced possible failure or closure. So first, to interface carpets. And the quote, people think, okay, now it's circular economy. And then they might forget about low carbon economy. And then they might forget about bio-based economy. And they might forget inclusive economy. Okay, you can discuss about the order, whatever, But it's and. That's the whole point. Only when a company can contribute to all those elements do I think you have this license to exist. So Interface is a US-owned company that is the world-leading maker of modular carpet or carpet tiles for offices and institutions. It was started by a businessman, Ray Anderson, in Atlanta, Georgia in 1973, and entered Australia in 1980 when it took over the Dutch-owned Hugo carpet manufacturing plant that had been established in Picton, south of Sydney, in the 1950s with state subsidies for industry decentralisation. Interface is famous for its commitment to environmental sustainability. Ever since Anderson, after reading Paul Hawkins' The Ecology of Commerce, had his sustainability epiphany. With input from an eco-dream team made up of pragmatic philosophers and biomimicry experts, Interface adopted a visionary plan called Mission Zero. It aimed to reduce any negative impact of their company's production on the environment by 2020. They abandoned the linear take, make, waste model and redesigned production along circular economy lines. As Anderson puts it, harvesting yesteryear's carpets and other petrochemically derived products and recycling them into new materials. They also then developed new bio-based synthetic carpet materials. Anderson's passionate embrace of sustainability took the company well beyond lip service to the triple bottom line. Says the former Australian CEO, the stories you hear in the business were that when he first started to communicate that to, say, Wall Street, they really thought that he'd lost his mind. He used to raise that subject on occasions and the share price would go down afterwards. But we're talking in the 90s, yeah. Then it became an advantage. So you go from being a heretic and a complete lunatic to actually you're in the leadership position. At the Australian plant, a critical incident occurred in 2012 and the company was working at full capacity, responding to, as the CEO called it, a tsunami of demand in the school sector as a result of Julia Gillard's education revolution. An electrical fault at the Picton plant burnt the whole factory down in a few hours on a Friday night, destroying a new $million loom that had just been installed. On the Monday after the fire, management met the workforce and guaranteed all the permanent employees at least 12 months' pay. This was a humane decision made incredibly quickly, as the CEO at the time said, while we work this through and we'll have a process of discovery of exactly what we're going to do. And it was also a business decision. As he said, we knew that to start up the new plant rapidly, we'd need to retain the skills of our people because carpet manufacturing or textile skills are very thin on the ground in Australia these days. While a new site was found, employees helped with the design of the new setup, production workers moved temporarily into customer service, and others did community projects in and around Picton, all on full pay. When the new plant was opened, in Minto a year later, some half to two-thirds of the original employees stayed on. Others chose to find employment closer to home in Picton. Today, the company is 95% the way towards reaching the targets set by Mission Zero, and they're now working on a new vision called Climate Takeback, led by the Australian plant, which now employs about 240 people. The objective is not just to reduce harm, but to produce positive good, to help restore the environment and address inclusion. One way they're combining these agendas is by reorienting production and installation of carpet around the reuse of carpet tiles, rather than the more energy-intensive recycling of materials. And for example, their Netherlands plant is pioneering collaboration with a social enterprise that employs people at a distance from the labour force to pick up, clean and just redistribute the used carpet tiles, many of which are thrown out long before their use-by date. So moving on to my second case, Varley, the company, Varley Engineering, that they're called the chassis making company. And the quote here, it's not just the business, it's our Varley culture, our way of how we want to run the business. Varley is the oldest firm in our study. It was founded by George Henry Varley in 1886 in Newcastle to do ship repairs. Today, it's one of Australia's major engineering and manufacturing companies, producing defence and aerospace equipment, specialist vehicles such as ambulances, rescuing vans, fire trucks, rescue vehicles and electric vehicles. It also provides rail, power and maritime maintenance services. It employs 600 people and operates in multiple locations around Australia and overseas. Over the years, the company has developed its capacity to provide engineering solutions that draw on innovative and iterative designs worked out in close collaboration with customers. It successfully leveraged its skilled workforce of shop floor trained and university trained designers and engineers. Many of the older employees grew up in the Hunter region and gained their first job experience in BHP and shipyard workshops. In the late 1990s, the company faced closure though. The workforce had contracted to 60 employees and the bank had taken over its administration. At that point, the current CEO, himself an in-law of a third-generation relation of the founder, was invited in to drastically reorganise the business. He cut back operations, reduced overheads, identified, as he said, what was working well and what wasn't, and what markets in the future were still going to be around and still going to be worthwhile us remaining in. The CEO likes to emphasise how Varley is a private company that's family owned, rather than your usual family-run business. But the family ownership of this company remains important. For one thing, it affords an independence from investment dynamics mediated by the stock market. In the 2000s, predatory asset stripping took place in the sector. As the manager of specialist vehicles put it, superannuation funds were looking for a quick dollar. Many of Varley's competitors signed up all these contracts, as he said, real cheap, to try and make the business look good to sell, and then the business starts to run out of cash and fails. Varley was able to benefit by acquiring some of these failed companies. Reflecting on the freedom from the stock market, the CEO talked about not being worried about what my share price is reading at the moment, or about what some analyst is predicting is going to happen to us in the future, or being told by other people out there that our overhead ratio is too heavy for this, or I'm not returning enough, or I shouldn't be investing in this or that. Along with this kind of independence, the Varley culture is associated with a real respect for the specialist skills that have been built up within the firm. In the words of one business unit manager, that's one thing that Varley do have, is people are human beings. And do we really can we get through this as a team? You've got to give them credit to it. That may be one of the things that's kept this place together. It has a reputation in that. The senior staff are loyal too, and those people are committed. It also has a deep-seated commitment to the long term. As another interviewee says, positioning ourselves and giving the customer the best we can, because we know they're going to be living with that product for 15 or 20 years, the least we want is someone saying, who built that? It doesn't work, or that it broke down. Okay, to Norco, to milk, and the Norco Dairy Cooperative. And the quote, globalisation has served its purpose and made us all aware that we need to change and move forward, but it doesn't mean that we need to abandon our own. Norco is a 125-year-old farmer-owned, consists of 220 dairy farmers who form the Producers Cooperative, 34 co-op-owned rural supply stores, and 3 manufacturing plants producing packaged fresh milk, milk powder and ice cream, and employing around 800 people, the majority full-time. Today it has close to $1 billion in sales per annum. It pays farmers the highest gate prices for raw milk and pays above award wages for factory floor positions in its 3 plants. Its current viability is attributed to lean production principles in its processing factories, customer relations that is built with organisations like Coles, and reputational trust with farmer members and customers in the region. A critical period for the co-op was in 1999, at the time when the industry was being deregulated and increased mergers and takeovers in the food industry posed huge threats to survival. Internally, the board were divided between those who, like the then chairman, wasn't overly co-op minded. It was more about how do we actually get this beast to a listing and actually get rid out of all the farmer directors and move away from the cultural issues of the cooperative. Farmer members were also divided over whether to sell out or to stay as a cooperative. To keep afloat, Norco strategically entered into partnerships with the largest industry players on the planet, the multinational milk marketer Parmalat and Fonterra, the New Zealand dairy multinational that's a cooperative in name only. The expectation was that they would be absorbed, but in both cases they were able at a later date to strategically and lucratively withdraw. A farmer member of the board assumed the chairmanship in 1999 and was able to rekindle loyalty to cooperative values. Ever since, he's pursued a slow strategy of expanding access to those values. As he says, this is about a strategy for Norco that has no end. So therefore we get to a certain point, I leave, but people can continue the journey on if they want. It's about leaving something behind, which is saying, it's that legacy piece of, I think this is a good strategy, but you go and play with it now. As in any democratically run organisation, the challenge is to continue to align the cooperative values of serving members' needs for a stable livelihood with company strategies for survival in a cutthroat global market for milk. Norco's ice cream manufacturing factory in Lismore is a key stabiliser of company income as it continues to produce over the year using stored inputs and can smooth out the seasonal fluctuations in milk sales. The cooperative ethos of care extends though beyond Norco's farmer members. Just 24 hours into the devastating 2011 Brisbane floods, Norco had offered to supply milk to Queensland while competitor Parmalat's flooded Brisbane factory was unable to produce. Norco's survival involves constant negotiation and renegotiation with industry competitors and members. The age of the farmer members, with many reaching retirement, is a major consideration. Some are attracted by the idea of selling their milk production licences to the highest bidder and pulling out of the producer cooperative. And so in order to address this, Norco has facilitated succession planning involving younger farmers taking on production while older farmers remain on their farms. Lastly then, to soft landing, and the quote here. We were leading as the biggest mattress recycler, and I think they might have had a different perception. Just the classic natural perception of a not-for-profit really, of us. And I think especially now they see we actually know what we're doing operationally, that actually we have these people on board. And the other is, I could tell you 100 different decision points where we could have gone this way, we could have done a dodgy there, could have cut a corner there. We've just said no, this is the path. So Soft Landing is a national social enterprise operating across New South Wales, ACT and Western Australia. It recycles mattresses that otherwise get dumped into landfill. It was originally established by Mission Australia in Bellambi, just north of Wollongong, at a time when the Wollongong City Council had introduced dumping fees at its landfill sites. Suddenly, old mattresses started to be left illegally at Mission Australian clothes bins, and this provoked a new business idea. Some 1.6 million mattresses are destined for landfill each year, from households, but also from hospitals, hotels and motels. Soft Landing has a social mission to employ groups who face barriers in the labour market, such as Aboriginal people experiencing disadvantage and ex-prisoners. Its environmental mission is to recover the mattress components for reuse. The steel is melted down for reuse, the wood is shredded for garden mulch, the fabric is manufactured into products such as removalist blankets, weed suppression and soil stabilisation matting. The waste industry is cutthroat, as the National Manager of Soft Landing admits. But this enterprise has been able to become the premier recycler in the sector by building up good relations with mattress manufacturers who've become increasingly concerned about the environmental impact of their product. A critical incident occurred in the early 2010s when a new private recycling company attempted to take Soft Landing over just as the social enterprise was seeking to grow nationally but was having troubles getting support from Mission Australia. The private company had state-of-the-art automated machinery and was eager to corner the Australian market. At national waste management conferences, this company would talk about the efficiency of its process and minimal labour inputs, while Soft Landing would demonstrate how its enterprise created jobs and ran at a profit. They appeared to be key rivals. Keeping true to their social mission, Soft Landing negotiated becoming part of Resource Recovery Australia, a large social enterprise focused on waste management and recovery. What they did then was to broker a relationship with their private sector competitor, whereby standard mattresses would go to the private automated process and more difficult non-standard mattresses would be taken by Soft Landing. As the national manager explained, it's still a partnership. We'll be the front face, we'll do the collection, we'll be the social enterprise. We deliver to you the volume of mats that can go through your machine and you push the button on and the widgets and whatever go. Great, we'll keep some mats aside for our guys that are existing. We want a net gain in jobs, so we don't want to lose any jobs, we want more jobs. Soft Landing has also taken the lead as the administrator of a national mattress industry product stewardship scheme. This involves suppliers, the companies that produce the foam and other inputs to the mattress, the manufacturers, many of whom are now starting to actually change their production process, knowing that at the end of the use of the mattress, it's going to be taken apart. Oops. Retailers who often pick up mattresses as part of their sale deal, and recyclers. It's a business model that involves for-profit and not-for-profit businesses, and it involves collaboration rather than competition. And Soft Landing has been able to take the lead as they're not in business for private gain. So partners and other stakeholders have confidence in them to entrust them with administrating across this competitive space. So that's the end of the 4 quick case studies, and let me turn then to some concluding comments. Let me return to address the 2 questions that I posed at the beginning of this lecture. Can manufacturing and the kind of consumption practices it fosters be part of a solution to global warming? And can manufacturing enterprises address disparities in wealth distribution and contribute to producing a more equal society? Well, the stories I've very, very sketchily presented give, I think, a very small glimpse of a diverse group of enterprises that are experimenting and negotiating their way toward these goals. On the one hand, these firms are doing no more than all the shoulds that are emerging from the numerous large-scale surveys and research reports being conducted by such organisations as the Office of the Economist, various research think tanks, the CSIRO, the Learned Academies, and so on. All of these reports are recommending what Australian manufacturing should be doing. And I think these companies are doing it. They're being strategic, they're being globally connected, customer-focused, service-oriented, and above all, bespoke. Very much working on niche kind of products for particular markets. But they're doing more than just staying at the cutting edge of business as usual. I'd like to suggest that they're pushing the envelope somehow. Maybe even prototyping a new kind of business model, one in which direct commitments to planetary and human survival play a decisive role. As Varley, Interface and Norco demonstrate, these enterprises have worked out ways to operate at some distance from private shareholder primacy, arranging capitalisation to meet long-term commitments. As we see with Interface and Soft Landing, a complex ecosystem of interdependence is developing between privately owned for-profit companies and not-for-profit social enterprises along the value chain. Nodes of skilled and unskilled labour intensity, of automation and hands-on designing, making and unmaking occur at different points around the circle of product production, service, reuse, recycle. And these nodes are linked to different allocations of surplus to ecological care and or social care. And as we see with Varley and Norco, and also to some extent Interface and Soft Landing, enterprises are enacting commitment to the long term and to people and their skills in place. Varley draws down and then replenishes an industrial knowledge commons that was built up in Newcastle but is spread throughout its network of plants. Norco is manufacturing in a highly competitive dairy market in order to defend the know-how of its dairy farmers and an ethos of cooperation that has a century-old lineage. It's ensuring that this ethos is passed down the generations. Interface is creatively struggling with how to repair our global commons. And Soft Landing is ensuring that the most disadvantaged in our communities are participating in and benefiting from care of our precious world. We're seeing, I think, the glimmer, how to project these glimmers onto a larger screen and enrol government and wider community support for these kinds of manufacturing futures is still a task at hand. So thank you very much for the opportunity.